Hello, and welcome to Canadian Rights Reviews, where we examine the ins and outs of Canadian rights, freedoms, laws, and policies. Canadian Bill C-10. Supporters will tell you it is simply about making online broadcasters, operating in Canada, pay their fair share. Opposition has called it the Internet Censorship Bill, and an assault on online free speech. There is much more going on, and in this video I will present the main issues and pitfalls related to the bill. Bill C-10 primarily is an amendment to the Canadian Broadcasting Act. In its current form it gives the Canadian Radio, Television and Communications Commission, aka the CRTC, the power to regulate and tax traditional forms of media in Canada. David Common recently spoke to our Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault about the bill on an episode of Power in Politics.
The statement has been made by the governing party that Canadians shouldn't worry. There would never be an imposition on their freedom and what they post on social media. But at the end of the day, if it's not there, it's not there. In other words, if the protection isn't granted, then there's no protection.
The Liberal government is facing accusations it's putting Canadian free speech at risk. The uproar stems from an amendment made to the government's broadcasting bill, that is C-10, and the change would allow the country's broadcasting watchdog to regulate content uploaded to social media. Stephen Guilbeault is the Minister of Canadian Heritage. He's in Montreal and joins us. Minister, thank you very much for taking the time this evening.
Good evening, David.
I know C-10 was brought about to try to get some accountability from the Netflixes of the world, to get them to contribute to Canadian content in the way that traditional broadcasters do. But this amendment was put in, and you stood up when it was introduced and talked about this exclusion that was part of the bill to basically protect user-generated content, to make it so that somebody putting something up on social media would not somehow, even inadvertently, be affected by this. You touted that. And now it is gone from the bill. What changed?
Nothing. Bill C-10, as you said in your introduction, is about ensuring that web giants pay their fair share when it comes to Canadian culture, like traditional Canadian broadcasters do. It's not a bill about content moderation.
But your original iteration of this bill took the step to actually put an exclusion in there so that people, user-generated content, would not be touched by this bill. And now that exclusion is gone from the current iteration. So I don't understand why it was valuable enough to put it in there before, but not valuable enough to keep it there now.
The bill is about ensuring that these companies pay their fair share. There's nothing about content moderation. User-generated content will not be affected by the amendment. I mean, can you imagine the CRTC?
But then why was it there in the first place? Why was it there in the first place?
Going after people posting pictures or videos of their cats.
So I'm going to flip the question for a moment here, Minister, because it was important enough to put that exclusion there in the first place. Now it's gone. Why was it important in the first place to put it there?
We're not interested. I mean, it's not what the bill is about.
I mean, I hear you saying you're not interested, but there literally was an exclusion that was put in the original iteration of that bill, the thing that was reviewed, and then it got to committee, and bingo, bango, bongo, the exclusion is gone. So why was it important to put it there in the first place, such that now the committee has removed it?
Well, I mean,
would you like to see the exclusion back in there?
It's not necessary. I mean, so
if it's not necessary, why was it there in the first place?
Well, we've worked on this for many months. We came up with what we thought would be the best possible bill, but bill can always be perfected. They will be amended. And it's not the purpose of the bill. Bill C-10 doesn't grant the CRTC the power to do that. So this whole conversation makes no sense.
But a former CRTC chair, Peter Menzies, has said, I'll quote here, granting a government agency authority over legal user-generated content doesn't just infringe on free expression, it constitutes a full-blown assault on it. That is from a former CRTC chair.
And I could quote you I could quote you. I've spoken 2 weeks ago to an ex-CRTC chair who said that social media platforms like YouTube should be subjected to Bill C-10.
That was very eloquent, Mr. Guilbeault. It's much more clear now. The bill essentially aims to expand the power of the CRTC to online mediums, which raises numerous issues. One of the primary directives of the CRTC is to promote, via regulation, Canadian content. The percentage of Canadian content required has steadily increased over the years. Currently, most radio stations in Canada are licensed with the requirement to play 40% Canadian content. Most television broadcasters are held to a 55% standard. Supporters of the bill have said they have no interest in regulating content. In my opinion, these percentages alone moderate content. Historically speaking, in order to meet Canadian content thresholds, our broadcasts have been filled with low budget and quite frankly terrible programming. This model is designed to promote Canadian artists, culture, and industry related to the traditional broadcasting mediums. This approach has left Canadian broadcasters unable to compete with other networks on an international level, as they are not showing the kind of programming people want to see and hear. With the evolution of the internet, more and more people are turning away from traditional broadcast media. This has put Canadian broadcasters in an even worse position. Bill C-10 proposes to apply the same Canadian content requirements to online platforms, and to require those platforms to pay into the CRTC, to prop up the failing Canadian media industry. The CRTC often grants funds collected to support creation of Canadian content to broadcasters. However, the nonsensical formula the CRTC currently uses to determine what is Canadian content, likely means none of the online broadcasters they are targeting would ever qualify for such grants. So it's not so much a tax, as much as it is stealing from the rich, to give to the less rich. For television and film, these are the current rules for Canadian certification. Under these rules, a production could be entirely filmed in Canada, include an all-Canadian cast and crew, but if the producer is not Canadian, neither is the production. We can make the producer Canadian as well, but if more than 25% of the costs of production are furnished by a non-Canadian company, again not Canadian, the rules for Canadian music are just as nonsensical. It is not enough that your favorite song is performed by a Canadian. The CRTC also needs to examine who wrote the lyrics and accompanying music. Perhaps the most famous case of this was in 1991, when Bryan Adams' hit Everything I Do was ruled to not be Canadian content by the CRTC. When asked about the ruling, Adams stated, "I didn't think much of it, I never thought much about Canadian content anyway. I always thought that it did nothing but breed mediocrity. I don't think any other country in the world would have declared their artists as un-American or un-British, so for the Canadian government to consider me un-Canadian is just ridiculous. Music is international. It belongs to everybody. There may be some argument that Canadian content rules helps young bands get started, but if anything, I keep telling you, I think it breeds mediocrity. Just based on Canadian content rules, if this bill passes, you can expect the content you currently enjoy on Netflix, Amazon Prime, Disney, and so on, to be reduced and replaced by endless episodes of subpar Canadian programming such as Due South and Corner Gas. Fully expect the associated costs of such changes to affect your monthly subscription cost as well. When this bill was first introduced, it was made clear they were not targeting social media platforms. This was changed due to pressure from special interest groups, i.e. the failing Canadian media industry. There was also language that individual contributors on social media platforms would not be subject to regulation. This has now also been removed. Can you imagine how much content you would lose access to, if YouTube is required to maintain 55% Canadian content in Canada? They don't want to regulate content though. Sure thing. The biggest issue related to content regulation and censorship is the broad language used in the bill. Heritage Minister Stephen Guilbeault, who originally introduced and is championing this bill, has stated numerous times they don't want to regulate individuals, they don't want to regulate content. The problem is the broad language of the bill allows exactly that. Some other things Mr. Guilbeault is on record wanting to do. Forcing news broadcasters to be licensed, including online sites. Criminalizing criticism of political figures, and wanting to be able to shut down websites within 24 hours if they do not conform to what the CRTC deems acceptable. No due process allowed. If you're not familiar with our Heritage Minister, Mr. Guilbeault has been a lifelong activist. In 2001, while working for Greenpeace, he was arrested for climbing the CN Tower and hanging a giant banner to support the Kyoto Protocol. Self-described as a radical pragmatist, he wants to decide what is fair and unfair to say online. Not criminal or not criminal, but fair and unfair. Under his reign as Heritage Minister, The CRTC has made grants to those supporting his views, including a $375,000 grant, to the very group he is citing as a source in defending Bill C-10. How is this for criticism, Mr. Guilbeault? Every time I see your stupid face I want to punch it. Your idiotic ideology amounts to nothing more than modern-day book burning, without the books. Leave the internet alone, stop trying to take away my choice of what media I would like to consume, because you think you know better than I, what is good for me. Go back to Greenpeace. While activism should be considered when creating legislation, a lifelong activist should not be creating it. You have no business being in politics. If this bill passes, the VPN providers are going to see a spike in business, rendering such changes of limited use anyhow. In my opinion, making statements that the new legislation will not be used in a certain way, while the language of the bill is contrary to that statement, is akin to a statement from last year. It's only 2 weeks to flatten the curve and then we can go back to life as normal. We see how that has worked out. Granting such power to our government has proven to be a slippery slope, and Mr. Guilbeault already has his skis strapped on. Stop Bill C-10. The government has no business regulating the internet. We will update you further if we learn of any meaningful developments in this case. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you again soon.